So, just a bit about me. I'm currently 23 years old, getting my master's degree in Vienna, Austria. I got my bachelor's at the University of Tennessee. I've published a number of articles in peer-reviewed journals with ancient coins, and I'm currently working on publishing a book about late Byzantine coinage. So my background is primarily numismatic, but I've also got tons of experience with everything else. So yeah. And then just a bit about the sources we're using. I figured most of you probably don't care about the specifics, but if you do, this will be recorded and up on YouTube, so you can actually find the individual sources. These are the primary, the secondary, and then for the slides, the images, if you're curious where those pictures came from, you can find those here. Cool. Loading should be coming soon. Maybe not. Let me escape for 1 second, see if this works. Here we go. Perfect. We just got a bit of slow Wi-Fi here. If it'll work. I'll go ahead and talk about it. So we're going to be looking at Michael VIII Palaeologus today. There's 3 phases of his life. It's loading, perfect. So we kind of have his career in 3 parts. The first part here is going to be the governor of a city. He's accused of treason. And we're going to see during his time as governor, his treason trials and his reconciliation, how Michael actually works with the Latin mercenary troops of Byzantium. In this period, Latin, so this would be Frankish, Italian, German, Spanish knights. They're actually a very big deal. So we'll look at Michael's life, how he works with them. Phase 2, after he clears his treason trial, he's accused of treason again. He runs away to the Seljuk Empire and actually works for them, managing Byzantine troops under their control. And then he comes back to Byzantium, and this time he actually commits the treason he was twice accused of, and becomes emperor himself. And then, yeah, we'll look through his whole story and kind of see the different troops he works with, and needless to say, he's quite a character. And so, yeah, right now we're going to go into phase 1 of his life. And this is a quote from his autobiography. So at this point, he's actually emperor, has become emperor, and he kind of describes his illustrious background. And this will go to show how the aristocracy actually view themselves in Byzantium. So Michael writes, I begin now with my parents. On the one hand, my father traces his family to ancestors who were empresses and my brothers and sons of laws of emperors, while my mother's ancestors were emperors. God therefore laid down of old both the brilliance for my ancestry and the foundation of my present power. So this kind of shows that for a figure like Michael, who's in the top tier of the aristocracy, he kind of comes from a rock star background. All of his cousins, brothers, uncles were emperors, were very high magnates in the empire. From both sides of his family. So he's a very well-connected individual, well-placed to succeed in Byzantium. And so phase 1 we're going to look at is the treason trial of Michael. So pretty much Michael is accused of treason by a local dignitary of the city he's governor of. And during this trial, he's faced the emperor, and the emperor actually fears Michael at this time. Like I mentioned, Michael's very connected. He's got lots of friends and powerful influence. And the worry of John, the emperor, is that Michael is trying to overthrow him, which given the future might seem likely that that was actually the case. But during this trial, this takes place in front of a military camp, and this whole experience kind of shows the power of the military. The Emperor John actually dislikes Michael. Like I said, he's worried about Michael, wants to actually get him accused and prosecuted and thrown in prison, but the military is so on the side of Michael that he actually can't do that. John, the emperor, cannot afford to alienate the army. With no evidence, both the Byzantine and Latin mercenaries actually support Michael and help him to get released. And so here we can see our first piece of military iconography. The man who wants to prosecute Michael, the Emperor John, this is him on a coin. And as we can see here on the coin, you've got the emperor showing himself in full military attire. He's got a mail shirt, mail armor, leather cloths and mail, and a full military suit. He's holding a sword here. The coin is kind of weakly struck, but you can see a hilt and the pommel, then the hand of God. And the labarum, what's in this other hand, is actually an old symbol of Christian military victory that dates back to Constantine. This was a battle standard that is closely tied to the idea of the sign of God, helping you to win. In hoc signo vinces, in this sign you shall conquer. So that labarum actually dates back to about 300 AD. This is the 1200s now. But you see the emperor presenting himself as being blessed by God, having a sign of victory from God, and then using that in a military context. So that's a bit about the Emperor John. But here's more about the trial. So this is a historian, George Acropolites, writing later on. But he says that Michael was loved, and the truth is loved, not by us alone, but also by all those in office, the generals, the soldiers, and the common people themselves. So here we see that Michael is already making tons of powerful friends early on in his career. The generals of the army love him, the bureaucrats love him, the soldiers love him, and the common people love him. So he's actually very well connected now. And even though the emperor himself, top of the hierarchy, wants to prosecute him, he can't. Got a question?
How old is Michael at this point?
He would be in about his 20s to 30s at this stage. So he's a young adult, more or less. And then anyway, this is more about that context. Furthermore, his intimacy with the magnates did not allow the emperor to hold Michael in contempt. So Michael's already very powerful here. We see he's making friends with soldiers, bureaucrats, and the magnates here, the elite families, pretty much protect their own, and the emperor actually can't do what he wants. And so Michael gets off free. And then this kind of reminds me of a quote from Cassius Dio, talking about Agrippa way back when in the early Roman Empire. About Augustus is unsure what to do with Agrippa. Augustus has won the whole empire, and Agrippa controlled all his armies, and he asks his good friend Maecenas, what do I do with Agrippa? He's so powerful, he's become a threat to me. And Maecenas says, you have made him so great that he either must become your son-in-law or be executed. And that same kind of logic now applies with John and Michael. Michael is so powerful, John could either threaten the civil war by killing him or making him a son-in-law. So what happens is then reconciliation. So Michael actually marries the niece of the emperor, and so he kind of becomes reunited with the imperial family. So this episode will take us to our first troop unit. So part of the reconciliation is that Michael is actually put in charge of a brand new office. This is the Grand Constable, and that's the person who's in charge of all Latin troops in the empire. So now, after this episode, we're going to see what kind of troops Michael might have controlled at this time. And so the Latin mercenary contingents would have mainly comprised of the famous knights we see in Western Europe. These would have been fully mailed out, decked out soldiers with armor. So for the helmet, what you might see, you might have a mail sort of coat, like a hoodie. You might have a kettle helm also. That's like what you see here, a helmet with sort of a wide rim around. You might have a bassinet, the Spangenhelm, great helms. We'll go into a lot of this later on, but we might also see for the neck, these medieval knights would have gorgets and collars. They would have head protection, neck protection. For their torso, they would have either a mail hauberk, they'd have plate armor, or like a leather gambeson, different outfits. Arms also protected, and legs also. I won't go too much into the actual specifics. We'll go into a bit more later on. But as you can see, these would have pretty much been ironclad warriors. Nothing was exposed. They were completely in mail and protective armor. It's actually very difficult to kill them, so they kind of take on an elevated role during this time just because they're so impossible to kill. And so the Latin mercenaries Michael would have overseen at this time, they would have been comprised of Italians, Germans, Catalans, Spanish, and French heavy cavalry units. And it's no coincidence. Like I mentioned, in order to reconcile Michael to the emperor, he's created as a Grand Constable. This is the first time anyone had this position, and Michael later becomes emperor. So it's no coincidence that this powerful position actually elevates him. He's in charge of all the Latin troops, and the Latin troops are very powerful. So that gives him a good base of support later on for his military usurpation. And this is kind of an earlier episode that's going to demonstrate why the Latin troops are so powerful. This would have happened about 1 decade before the birth of Michael. And this is the Battle of Antioch on the Meander. You had 2,000 Byzantine cavalry and 800 Latin knights against 11,000 Seljuks. So the Byzantines are heavily outnumbered, but they have Latin knights, which gives them a huge edge in this environment. The Latin knights actually lead the vanguard, and they fight to the death to the man at the beginning of the battle. All 800 more or less die, but they almost cripple the Seljuks because they're so ferocious they kill many times their number as an individual soldier. So they're kind of seen as a crack troop. And then in this battle, actually, the Byzantine emperor gets captured by the Sultan, and the Sultan's about to order him to be taken as prisoner. The emperor kind of recovers, pulls out a sword, chops off the front legs of the horse of the Sultan, and then beheads the Sultan in single combat. So it's kind of a fun episode in military history, too. You can see the emperor here holding up the head of the Sultan in battle. So he was almost captured alive, but thankfully beheaded the Sultan and survived. That also helped the Byzantines later on. But this is kind of just a fun story about the Latin knights, sort of their ferocity, reputation. A quote about this episode. So here, the Italians means the Western Knights. The historian says, the Italians were the first to attack the Sultan's forces, but the number of Muslims was great. Exhibiting deeds of great prowess and an even more noble soul, nearly all the Italians fell, having put many times their number to the sword. So this episode just kind of highlights these Latin knights were ferocious, they were heavy, they would fight to the death. A lot of times other units in this time retreat, they're kind of scared, don't want to risk their lives. But the Latin knights really put their heart and soul in the battlefield, and because of their heavy armor, they're almost unstoppable. So they're very powerful troops at this time and used by the Byzantines. What you might see here, this is not from a Latin knight, but kind of what you might see for them. Typically the horses go unarmored in this period. You might imagine other Western knights have a full set of armor on the horse, but this is going to be in Greece, the Peloponnese, and Turkey. It's a very rocky, rough terrain. Actually having all that armor is going to be cumbersome to the knight and might actually slow them down. So you typically don't see armor on the horse. It's also very expensive. It's tough to field that for all your soldiers. So you might see heavy knights and an unarmored horse. But as you can see here, the knights are pretty much covered head to toe in armor, small shield, and a long sword. That's very typical of what they might carry in this period. And so here we see some more military iconography. This is the rival to Byzantium, but it demonstrates what the knights would have looked like. This is the Latin kingdom. So in 1204, the Latins take over Constantinople and make it their own. This is a seal from the emperor showing himself as king, an emperor, and then also him on horseback. And as we see the emperor on horseback, once again, even the emperor, the head of the state, has an unarmored horse. It's just typical of the period. You can make out the individual links of chainmail all throughout the figure. Again, a long sword and a short shield, and also a great helm. So we kind of see here the emperor presenting himself as a knight, and this was sort of seen as a quintessential position of the emperor as a military leader, especially for the Latiners. And these kind of troops would have fought with the Byzantines as sort of auxiliary troops. And then again, a similar seal from a different emperor. We kind of see again similar concepts: a horse without armor, the mail, the sword, the shield. Very common outfits at this time. So this is actually a common tactic we know of. Again, the Latin knights were so heavily armored, it was almost impossible to kill them. Very, very difficult. Took a lot of effort. A tactic mentioned in the Alexiad about a century before this period was go for the horse of the Latin knight. If you can kill his horse, you kill his mobility, maybe then you capture him alive. So it was actually seen as a smart tactic in this period. Go for the horse and not the knight, because the knight is so heavily armored, this makes it very difficult. But the horse had no armor, therefore if you kill him, the horse is going to be stuck, or the knight will be stuck where he's at. So that was a common tactic as well. So that was kind of phase one. You just kind of see Michael as head of Latin troops. Those are the kind of troops he would have dealt with. He would have had heavy Western knights in full armor, very tough crack units that have a big reputation in this period. In period two now, phase two, Michael is again accused of treason. This time he's not reconciled and he flees to the Seljuks, and we'll see when he's there, he's commanding Byzantine troops. We'll take a look at what the Byzantine troops would have been wearing and doing. And so the background to this is the Emperor John, who wanted to get rid of Michael, dies. He's succeeded by his son, Theodore II. But Theodore II, he's an emotionally volatile epileptic who's probably bipolar. We're not quite sure what he had, but he prosecuted a lot of the aristocracy, blinded many generals, sort of went on purges, and was very quickly disliked. And so Michael was actually tipped off by one of his friends that he was going to be blinded if he didn't flee. So Michael had the choice of staying behind, being blinded, or sort of going over to the enemy. So he crosses lines, goes to the Seljuks, and when he's there, he's appointed as a head of all Romans in the Seljuk army. So he's kind of made as a lead Byzantine general under the Seljuks. At this period, Seljuks actually took over former Byzantine lands. So you had a lot of Byzantine soldiers in the Seljuk Empire still now fighting for the new masters, the Seljuks. So Michael goes over, he's taking over Byzantine contingents. What might they look like? And so in comparison with the very heavy Western knights, Byzantine troops in general are going to have lighter armor. They're not going to have the full mail. They're not going to have as extensive breastplates, greaves, all this, which you mostly see for the torso also, the bassinet, or not the bassinet, sorry, the gambeson. It's sort of a leather jerkin. This was very common for Byzantine soldiers. They typically didn't have as much mail or plate armor as their Western mercenary counterparts. Which you might also see, the helmets tend to be about the same. You would also have kettle helms, bassinets, Spangenhelm as well. Also neck protection, but again, in general, they're going to be less heavily armored. A lot of times, the legs of Byzantine soldiers wouldn't have any plate armor at all, whereas a Western knight is head to toe in steel. Byzantines are going to be more maneuverable, but then they're going to be more exposed with less armor. So it's kind of a trade-off in the period that you see. And so Byzantine weapons here. Excuse me. So very common, what you might expect, the axe, the spear, sword, and daggers. These are very common. Here we can see 3 examples of the Byzantine axe that would have been used on the battlefield. And this here is a coin with an emperor. This is actually Michael VIII once he becomes emperor. We see him depicting himself with a sword. So this is very common, pretty much the weapon of choice. And if you're the emperor, how you portray yourself, sort of the sword is the most manly item. Axes, the rest are kind of seen as subpar weapons, maybe for more foreign units, things like that. But the sword actually had a very ceremonial role in the empire, and that was kind of the key piece of weaponry for the emperor. And then also one notable distinction is the crossbow never really was adopted in Byzantium. In fact, by the Byzantines, it was called the Latin bow. They tend to stick with the traditional bow and arrow in units and don't actually adopt the crossbow. And when you see the crossbow, usually it's going to be Western auxiliaries that have come in with the crossbow. That's one notable distinction. The Byzantines never adopted that. And then for helmets, the kettle helm is very common in Byzantium. This will be a helm with a wide rim at the bottom to protect against blows and deflect them. And this helm is very famous. It's so-called the Alexander Nevsky helm. It was a gift from the Byzantines, a diplomatic gift to the Russian Empire at the time. And as we see, it's of high craftsmanship. You've got military or religious iconography. You've got Christ here in the center, St. John the Baptist, and the Theotokos, the Virgin Mary. A helm like this most likely never was worn in battle. It's too ornate. It's covered in gold and silver plates. But it goes to show the craftsmanship of the time, and that these people kind of saw the military weapons, helmets, and decorative things as very important in ceremony as well. It shows that they would put the time and effort in to make a helmet like this that never would have been worn on the battlefield, but still showed a ruler's prowess sort of behind the scenes. In the Cowell helm, you see very often. Most sort of contemporary helms would be a lot less ornate, but this is kind of the supreme example of the period of Byzantine craftsmanship, and maybe the best kind of helmet they could craft, what it would look like. And then also, kind of mentioned before, you can see the Spangenhelm with an aventail. So this would be sort of almost like a cap, an iron cap, with a ring mail to protect the neck down of a soldier. This is very common. When you do see elite Byzantine soldiers, typically you'll have sort of a mail shirt and then also this helmet. That's sort of very common in the period. And for Byzantine troops, that's what you often see. And the Byzantines, unlike the Latinites, sometimes did use fully armored horses, but this is sort of in the later period, not seen as often. And then for contemporary depictions, here we see Byzantine cavalry in the Peloponnese. This manuscript is about 100 years after our period, but still shows sort of the soldiers we'd be dealing with. These are the stratioti. They were sort of a local mix of Byzantine, Albanian, and sort of Balkan cavalry. And they sort of demonstrate the different helms we've been talking about. Here you see the kettle helm again. And note also the horses here have no armor again. They're going to be pretty much just going with the horse without anything for maneuverability and to be able to pretty much traverse the terrain in the Peloponnese. So here we see a different type of soldier, a Byzantine stratiotes again, wearing a mail shirt, and also he's wearing a clap visor bassinet. So that's kind of a famous medieval helm that has a visor that'll open up and close down. That'll give you full coverage all the way down. The aforementioned kettle helms we looked at, they pretty much protect the head from about the ear up, but nothing else. So the idea was a trade-off here. You can see better out of a kettle helm, and you also have better hearing as well. But the bassinets, you have worse hearing, worse vision, but much more protection. So it was kind of a trade-off, and we see that there's no sort of standard uniform as well in this period. Soldiers kind of picked out their own armor, whatever you could afford, you would wear. And so some soldiers might prefer a bassinet, some might prefer a kettle helm. It just kind of depended on the soldier, what they wanted. But we do see a good mix of that sort of armor in this period. Here's some more depictions of this. So here we can see a stratiotes, again, wearing a bassinet, this time without a visor to clap up and down. And then over here we see a Byzantine soldier wearing plate armor, wearing a kettle helm. So it's kind of like a choose-your-own uniform in this period. It's very much just like what you could afford or what you preferred as a soldier is what you would wear and what you would use. And then phase 3 here. So we've kind of gone through the first two phases. The first phase is Michael as head of Latin troops. We kind of saw what Latin troops would wear. They're heavy cavalry, fully decked out in armor. Phase 2, we see more of the Byzantine troops. These Byzantine troops would have been lighter, a good mix of various armors, whatever they preferred, but in general, leather jerkins, helms, and that's about it. And in phase 3, we're going to see Michael's return to power and a couple more examples of military iconography. So we see here at Michael, we've seen kind of his rise to power. He becomes governor, he becomes head of Latin troops, he flees to the Seljuks, now he returns to the empire. Emperor Theodore II, the one who wanted to put out his eyes and blind Michael, is dying, so he returns down to the empire. And we kind of see that Theodore II has only ruled for 4 years, but during that time he's angered everyone in Byzantium. He actually favored having native Greek Byzantine troops over Latin troops. The idea was the Greeks are one people, therefore we should promote our own people as soldiers over foreigners. But this actually very much angered all the Latin soldiers. And as aforementioned, the Latin soldiers were kind of the crack troops of this period, the best of the best. So that was actually very dangerous. So at this time when Theodore is dying, pretty much every Latin troop in the empire hates Theodore, and they're all allied with Michael because Michael was their first commander. So he's already got a very powerful base of troops coming back. And then we also see the aristocracy, who Michael's very much intimately connected with. They also hate Theodore because Theodore did a lot of purges, a lot of blindings, prosecutions of the aristocracy. So Michael kind of comes back to a dying emperor with pretty much everyone in society behind him. And this is very bad for Theodore because he's left behind a young son, who we'll get to in one sec. But this is before Theodore passes away. This is an example of him on a coin. And it's what you also see for the military iconography. A lot of times the emperor won't present himself as a soldier, but rather he presents himself under the divine protection of a saint. So in this case, we have St. George here, who's decked out again in military outfit attire. He's got a breastplate, leather jerkin pants, and also a spear. But the idea here is that the emperor kind of doesn't even have to go fight. He's so powerful and so protected by God that the saints will do his fighting for him and protect his empire. So this kind of messaging sort of shows that, unlike his father John, who we saw in the full military outfit, here Theodore kind of proclaims that I have divine protection on my side. They do the fighting for me. They protect me. But anyway, back to his son and his dynasty. Theodore II has left pretty much everyone hating him. He dies after a brief reign of 4 years from what scholars think might be cancer. We're unsure. But he leaves a young son behind in a regency council. And as mentioned before, Michael has pretty much all the Latins behind him. He has all the aristocracy behind him, a lot of the soldiers. And it's not going to go very well for John, the young son. We're going to go a bit into the story. This will be kind of fun, just to read about the brutality of Byzantine politics, what might happen here. So yeah, the context here is that the son of Theodore II, John, is in charge, or has been put underneath the regency council of George Muzalan. And George Muzalan is kind of seen as the figurehead for everything that's gone wrong. He's hated by the aristocracy for being a new man, a novus homo. He was promoted to this without any aristocratic background, so he's kind of the figurehead and who everyone wants to kill at this time. And so here's a quote from this story. This is at a memorial service for the Emperor Theodore. So he's been dead maybe a week. His body's not even cold. They're going to this church to pretty much bury him, pay their homage, and this is what happens. Michael stirs up a rebellion. And the author picks up, so the context, at a memorial service in a church for Theodore II. Straight away, they being the crowd, straight away they hastened, enraged and extremely agitated, and swords in hand, into the church. And at once, at the sight of these men thirsting to kill, the sacred hymns ceased, and the singers fled hither and thither, slipping into corners where they hoped to find safety. As for the Muzalan brothers, those are the regents of John, who were under Theodore. One ran into the sanctuary where he eased himself under the altar, believing that it would provide safety, while the other squeezed himself behind the door of the church. Their brother-in-law, who, because he had a share of their good fortune, was now to be associated in their misfortune, hurriedly hid himself away near the imperial tombs. As for George Muzalan, he also withdrew into the sanctuary of the church, and when he came to the apse of the prothesis and hid himself behind one of the tall columns, he trusted in the darkness and inviolability of the sanctuary. But it was impossible to escape from the danger. In a fit of berserk fury, the attackers charged in, searched meticulously, leaving no corner of the church unexplored. As a result, the Muzalan brothers were found one by one, seized and killed at the whim of their captors. Many surrounded each brother, cutting him down, striking and tormenting the wretch even after he was dead, so that a man who was once one was cut into many. As for George Muzalan, the main regent, the main hated figure, a certain Carl, had decided to enter the sanctuary and was about to give up, but fate did not allow Muzalan to escape suffering, for as Carl entered the prothesis, examining it and all around, he saw the unfortunate man on his knees on the ground. And upon seeing Muzalan, he quickly moved to kill him without mercy. Muzalan besought him, offering a ransom for his blood for a great amount, but Carl had no regard for this attitude of supplication. He immediately seized upon him and killed him with his dagger. When this deed became known, nobody departed from the palace, but everyone approached, striking the body, insulting and tormenting it. They carved it up to such an extent that the undertakers had to put the pieces into a sack and carry him out to bury him. Afterwards, the crowd all rushed out to loot the pavilions of those who had been murdered. So here we kind of see a very violent episode of Byzantine politics where the emperor and his regency, his son, are kind of taken out. And the coup d'etat happens because, as mentioned, if you see here, Carl is not a Byzantine name. This is actually a Western soldier of Michael who does the final deed, who cuts the region into many pieces. And in Byzantine politics, once the coup starts, it no longer becomes about the political message. A lot of times, people just enjoy the violence and start acting and partaking in the fun. So as you see the last sentence here, afterwards, the crowd rushed to loot the pavilions of those who had been murdered. So it kind of no longer becomes about the political message or killing a hated regent. Now it's just everyone wants fun. They want to get the silver plates of the elite, loot their tents, get their clothing. This violent episode just kind of goes to show that an earlier power base of Latin troops and soldiers actually helps Michael later on commit a coup. And so we kind of see a lot of different threads coming together in this episode of just how a Byzantine aristocrat might see his career progress and how he might come to fruition into power eventually. So here we see that Michael then topples the regency by cutting them into many pieces and murdering them, and places himself at the head. And so this just kind of goes to show, as I mentioned, the path to emperorship as a member outside of the imperial family, it's often with subterfuge and military assistance. Sort of a peaceful transition of power from one dynasty to another never happens in Byzantium. It's not really a thing. Sort of the 5 good emperors passing on to a worthy successor, it's not really an idea in Byzantium. It's more of, if I can take the throne, I will. A lot of times, in this case, there was actually motive for it. We saw that Theodore II, the previous emperor, alienated the Latin troops who sort of abused the aristocracy. They actually had motive to rise up, but sometimes just for the fun of it, just to seize power. But we can kind of see here how an emperor might utilize his earlier troops to actually succeed. And then here are some more examples of military iconography, not from Michael, but from general in Byzantium. This is another example of an emperor on a coin, showing the divine to help him. Again, we see an emperor in sort of civilian emperor clothing in the peaceful stance, who's then protected by a divine saint. Kind of goes to show that the Byzantines often relied on the sort of iconography of the divine to help them succeed. So they counted on that for their success in battle. Then also here is a codex from the 1300s that actually shows the 1204 sack of Constantinople. We can see here the walls of the city and also the Byzantine troops inside. We see the famous Byzantine banner, the red flag with a golden cross and 4 bees on it that sort of became synonymous with the royal house of the Byzantines, no matter who was in charge. And as for the Byzantine troops here, we see the various helmets we already looked at. So the Spangen helm is very common, the kettle helm as well. So we kind of see again, though, there's a mix of helmets here, a mix of armor. The troops were not uniform, but sort of had whatever military attire they wanted, whatever they could afford. Here's another example, this time of an emperor in a more military stance. We see the emperor right here being crowned by Christ, but the emperor is actually wearing a military cloak, the sagion. We see this draped over his shoulder, and this was also sort of a piece of attire associated with the emperor and his military ship. The sagion was a military cloak, and the emperor was the one who would have the most ornate version of this, heavily bejeweled, covered in purple and gold. So we see here the emperor wearing this and holding a sheathed sword as well. So this goes to show that a lot of times on the coinage of the era, the emperor would present himself as a military general as well, and that Christ would sort of bless and agree with this whole scene. And then another famous example, this is also a bit after our period. This is the Emperor John VI Cantacuzene. But if we look, he's actually presiding over a holy church council, the 5th Council of Constantinople here. We see many bishops and priests around. But if you look in the back, we actually have one of the last depictions of the Varangian Guard of Byzantium behind the emperor protecting him. We see them here in the picture and also here, wearing blue cloaks and a sort of helm here that's white with a golden cross on top. But we can kind of see here too that even in what might be seen as a religious context, a religious council, we also have the emperor showing his military might anyway and his protection, and that it was consciously chosen to depict the soldiers in this picture, even though it wasn't necessary. So it kind of goes to show that the emperor did like to show he had military power, did like to show he had troops, and would not hesitate to show that off and use them. And then another picture here is the emperor sort of depicting the city he ruled over, Thessaloniki, where this coin was struck, also holding a sword, kind of showing that the emperor as a figure both protects the city he has and with the sword defends it. So it kind of shows that he's, again, ordained by God and is willing to actually fight for his city and fight for his people. So this kind of surmises the Byzantine attitude. So kind of through this talk, I think nearing the end here, but just kind of showing how through one figure, Michael Palaeologus, how a Byzantine might jump through different military stations in life and then utilize those later on to actually commit a coup and take over power. And then the Byzantine emperors like to show themselves in military iconography. They had different ways of doing that. They might show themselves as a soldier or show themselves as being under divine protection. But throughout the whole period, the military aspect is very, very important to the emperors. Ultimately, it comes down to the military. That's how they protect themselves, how they have legitimacy. And if you don't control the military, you'll get overthrown and killed, like Michael did to the regency of Theodore. But yeah, that's the talk. And I'll also save some time here for the end. I brought a bunch of Byzantine coins with military iconography that we can go look at and kind of investigate and see different depictions of emperors showing themselves under divine protection with soldiers. But yeah, I'll go ahead and take some questions too if you guys have any. And then at the end, we can look at these in the way back.
So you described Theodore II as being violent and alienating the aristocracy with violent purges, correct?
Yes.
And therefore you might have some sort of bipolar with one theory you might have. Doesn't that seem like just this general Byzantine politics to get in power and then execute everyone who was then opposed to? Because
Maybe.
trusting the aristocracy does seem to be Byzantine emperorship 101.
I think the difference is what you might have is that the aristocrat comes into power would favor his aristocratic friends and then harm the ones who were against him. But in this case, Theodore attacked everyone. So by universal alienation, then he really just kind of, excuse my French, pissed off everyone in the empire, and so pretty much got brutally overthrown. Yes.
Fabulous presentation. Was this after the Fourth Crusade?
Yes, it was. This was like the 13th century, so pretty much right after that, the events of the...
So how did the Greeks take back control from the Latins after that?
Yeah, that's actually a very random story. You might think it was a military conquest, but actually it was that sort of a minor Byzantine general was walking through the area at the time, and they found an abandoned aqueduct or a gate that went into the city, so they all climbed in and ended up taking the city that way. So it was actually by sort of Michael the Emperor who was actually overseeing that. He claimed it was divine intervention to let the Byzantines retake it, but it wasn't through a siege, it was actually through just finding an empty hole into the city, more or less, that the troops crawled through. And then, of course, they surprised his troops inside, took it back. Yes?
Yeah, it is a tradition in ancient and medieval writing for after emperor, king, or whatever dies, to basically slander them. And I'm wondering the source for Theodorus, Theodore II, being a bad guy. Did that actually come from Michael's reign?
So it's very interesting. With Theodore II, he's actually behind the Emperor Julian in the 4th century, Julian the Apostate. We actually have the most amount of writing from any emperor. He's number 2 in the whole history of the empire. So we actually have, I would probably guess, in the tens of letters from him that are actually his hand, his thoughts written out. And so we know actually from his writing, his political theory, that Emperor Theodore actually viewed hatred as a good measure of authority. He thought that the more hated he was, the more he was doing his job. It becomes very complicated, the theory behind that. But we actually know from his writing that Theodore sort of intentionally sought out to abuse the aristocracy and take away their power. So even though the sources afterwards might be somewhat biased against him, especially George Acropolites, we still know from his writing, though, that he sort of intentionally sought out this infamy in a certain sense because he wanted to take away the power of the aristocracy. Any more questions? We've got some time, so yeah, no.
So, despite the Byzantines being so advanced, how come their coins were kind of primitive compared to like the earlier times?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, the coins, we don't actually know why. So if you go to an example of a coin, you can see this is actually, I don't know if you can make this out, it's cup shaped, it's not flat. If you look, you kind of have an outer ring here and an indent. You'll see the coins later on in the hands-on session, how they look like. But actually no one knows why they were struck like this. There actually is like no explanation, none of the sources talk about it, but it's thought that it was actually an anti-counterfeiting method, that if you struck a coin skiffate, it would be harder to imitate. But we also have imitations from the period, so if that was a theory, it wouldn't have worked out because people did copy these and did forge them. So we're actually not sure, and part of the problem why they look so bad is when you have two curved dies, if the curvature does not match up exactly, you're going to have a blank strike, which then ruins all the details and looks pretty bad. And of course, if you're in 13th century Byzantium, you're going to carve your dies by hand. What are the odds you get two exact perfect curvatures to match up? Not that likely. So even though some of the coins we see here were of much better detail perhaps, like this one is quite nice, quite sharp, we have full details, that's usually not the case. And it's actually very hard to find a good looking Byzantine coin. They're sort of infamous for looking bad. So short answer, we don't know. Long answer, we don't know. But the long answer has some more details in there. So hopefully that answered your question. Yes, there's
So do they stack easier?
not really.
No?
Yeah, they'd kind of fall over after 2 or 3. I tried just for fun, but no, yeah, it's just kind of a mystery in that sense. More questions?
My other question was, the Latin troops fighting with the Seljuks were less armored than their Latin counterparts.
So those were actually
Were they
Byzantine
all
troops.
with the Seljuks with that kind of armor?
The Seljuks didn't have many Latin mercenaries. They were usually Byzantine mercenaries fighting for them. So it was kind of the Byzantine troops in general who were less armored. The Latin ones were kind of known for their prowess with their armor because they were almost indestructible. We actually have stories of in the 4th Crusade, a Latin knight climbing onto the Byzantine armaments and just being indestructible. The Byzantines had no weapon that could kill him. He just walks through, does whatever he wants, and none of their weapons could pierce his armor. So they were kind of seen as like, I don't know, like a Warhammer Terminator or some sort of beast that just can't be taken down no matter what you have. So it becomes very difficult.
I had a question about this curve. Do you know if they were made from blanks or if they are using self-cutting stamps to cut them out of sheets?
For the coin flan,
Yeah.
they seem to have been poured out into hammered out. So like you would have had sort of maybe a sheet.
If you're self-cutting with a single stamp, that will produce a curved edge.
Okay, well we know that dies were curved though, so it was part of the minting process.
But that's part of making if many Europeans cut their coins out, use coin blanks that they put in and use. But if they're cutting them out of a sheet, you're gonna end up with curved
Well, if you
edges.
go to a flan, we can actually see from the flan that they're not cut out. Some of the contemporary coins that are flat that are cut out, you can tell by the way the edge is formed, whether or not it was cut out or, as you mentioned, sort of a one-off flan that was then hammered on. So we do know they were one-off flans used, and we know the dies were curved. There just really isn't an explanation for it. There's a lot of controversy behind that. That could be a 2-hour presentation on the intricacies of that. But yeah, short answer, it's just sort of a mystery that there's not really a determined scholarly consensus around.
So, throughout the Europe and maybe even Middle East, did this type of coinage, was it common, or like let's say in the Persian Empire we would have much better coins, or let's say in Italy would mean much better coins?
So in this
Better
period,
looking coins.
no. The solidus is actually the predecessor for this. That's a flat 4.5 gram gold coin. That actually became sort of an adopted standard pretty much around the Mediterranean. But at this point, sort of the Byzantines are too small of an empire to have much of an economic influence. So you might see local Serbians who sort of want to appear Byzantine for sort of legitimacy. They might mint Byzantine style coins, or you see it also from the Bulgarians, but outside of that, not really, no. At this point, they're just kind of too economically weak to have much of an influence with the coinage.
What happened to the older coins typically? Like, would the emperor be like, oh, let's keep the old emperor's visage on there? Or would it be like, okay, I'm gonna recall everything, remint it, and then send it out? Or
Yeah,
do
so
you get what
we
I'm-
know from overstrikes that did happen reusing coins, but there didn't seem to be, there was never, from what we can tell, a vendetta, as in an emperor usurps, therefore he's going to gather all of his predecessors' coins just to make sure that his iconography is gone and the new emperor's is put out there. That didn't really happen from what we can tell, but we do know coins were sort of recycled often, so that did happen. But that was more of an economic sort of a way to save money, I suppose, in a certain sense. It wasn't really with any sort of message behind that, just the idea of coins already circulate, if I restrike, my symbol's on there now. But it wasn't really sort of to erase someone else's legacy, just sort of to make the current emperor have an easier time of minting coins. Yes?
So I noticed that most of the coins you're showing here are silver. How many gold coins did they issue in this
Yeah.
period?
So typically for an emperorship, the thing is with silver and bronze, we have pretty much a new type issued every year. So they would have a new design, so you get a lot of variety on those. The gold coinage, it was typically one gold design for the entire reign. It was usually the same design adopted from emperor to emperor. You have a couple transitions, but for the most part you have maybe 3 or 4 emperors who kind of share one gold design. They would just change out the emperor's face and the legend to have his name on there instead of the previous one. But the reason I didn't include those, the gold coinage didn't really have that much military iconography, so it just didn't really make the presentation. But they're actually very common. I mean, besides bronze, gold is the most common. Silver is actually very rare in this period. It's kind of tough to find. But the gold coinage is pretty frequent. It's just not military in nature. You usually just have the emperor and the Theotokos in this period. So the Virgin Mary. The Virgin Mary crowns the emperor, and the back is Christ. But there's just going to be no military saints or whatnot.
The other question I was going to ask is, do you see a lot of examples where they're clipping the coins?
You do, yeah. It's very frequent. You do see also sort of in different reigns, you might have a new economic system established of maybe a lower weight standard. You sometimes find the older, higher purity coins cut down to match the new standard. So that's also very common. Then you also have economic defrauding, people trying to cut off coins to save a bit of money or whatnot. There's famous stories of a little bit earlier, people would have a bag of gold coins and just shake and shake and shake till dust would come out of the bottom, melt the dust down, cast a new coin as a way to sort of fraud the system and sort of recollect resources. So that was kind of seen in this period, not so much, but you do have some examples of cutting and whatnot. But usually it was not in the sense of defrauding, but just to actually match a new system, a new denomination, new weight standard. Yes, in the very back.
So when you showed the coin of the Latin king,
Yeah.
we took over the concept of gold. I'm assuming that's Latin Empire?
Yes, so those were actually lead seals. They're not coins. The Latin emperors did issue coins. We'll look at some up here. But these are actually very impressive pieces. They would be, I mean, the coins up here are going to be maybe a quarter size or smaller. These would be presentation pieces. You would have an imperial letter you would send out, and this would be on the letter attached to sort of verify this comes from the emperor. This is an official document. The Latin emperors, as far as I'm aware, didn't issue very many, but the Byzantines actually would issue this in gold. They would have a gold seal to represent I'm the emperor, and only the emperor can issue a gold seal. It was kind of a symbol of status for him.
So my question is, you describe his armor as chainmail, and particularly the other one shows it a little better.
Mm-hmm.
The Byzantines have chainmail.
They do.
The Byzantines have variations of laminar plate.
Yes.
You describe the lands as being much more heavily armored, but for the period pieces, they're wearing the same gear, and the soldiers are wearing chainmail.
Yes.
So where does the concept that the lands are more heavily armored come from?
Well, it's more that like their main focus is the heavy cavalry. They're going to have, each knight would have a retinue also of less heavily armored troops. You might have, a lot of times the crossbowmen would come as part of the retinue. For the Latins though, it's like that is their main impetus, the main weapon of force. For the Byzantines, it's more flexible. Even though it is cavalry focused, we actually see from, I mean, this would be sort of the mid-empire onwards, the cavalry becomes a little bit less important in a certain sense. So it's not that the Byzantines don't have that and they don't use it, it's just more that it's sort of less emphasized in a certain sense. So you kind of see more variation.
So if you have 1,000 Latin knights as your mercenaries, they're all at high-level knight armor. But if you have 1,000 Byzantine soldiers, you have 100 in the knight armor, 100 crossmen, 500 peasants, and 100 bowmen, all in a variety of armor.
Typically,
So
yeah.
they come off as being more heavily armored because the whole block is basically the heavy armor.
It's more force in numbers too. I mean, kind of the idea of these Latin charges too, where it's not only they're well armored, but that actually creates a lot of impetus too. You have 1,000 heavy knights charging at you. I mean, you might just blow away with who's ever in front of you. Whereas Byzantines, not the same formation, not the same strength in numbers, where maybe they have equatable numbers of cavalry too, but just maybe not concentrated, not in one area. So you kind of just see for them, they have those units that are just not as frequently seen and seemingly not in as large of numbers, but they're still there, still used.
There are a lot of different valuations, like our coins, pennies, nickels. Did they have the different levels back then?
Yeah, so what you would see, it's kind of different also, I guess. Like in modern times, you would have, if you're in America, you just have the US dollar, that's it. You might get a Canadian penny in your change, but if that's an annoyance if you have that. Typically, you're just in one country, use one denomination, one currency from your government. And this time, though, it was very different. The coins were more or less valued on the metal inside and the weight of the metal. So, I mean, the Byzantines issued pretty much 3 denominations, 4 really, but a gold coin, a silver coin, and a bronze coin, more or less. You might have some variations, but to simplify it, you would just have gold, silver, bronze. But you might also have silver Venetian coins coming into the empire through trade. So they would actually see a lot of coin hoards in the time represent a lot of Italian coinage, a lot of sort of Peloponnese. You had in Greece, the Latins take over, issue their own Latin coinage in Greece. So you actually see a lot of different coinages from different empires being circulated together. It wasn't like in Byzantium you would only use Byzantine coins, more just they accepted gold, silver, and bronze. If you had that in a different denomination, different country, it was also accepted and used. But in general, for the Byzantines, it was just gold, silver, bronze in the cup shape. We go back there, but the cup-shaped coins in gold, silver, or bronze. Yes.
Why didn't the Byzantines try to copy the Latin heavy cavalry? Just
I mean,
was it
they
cheaper, or just
they
like,
kind of
thinking
do.
It's just like train up, copy. This is good. Let's copy it almost.
I think the issue there is somewhat. It's not that they're not effective in the east, but against sort of the Turks and sort of the Ottomans who come up. I don't know. You kind of see a difference in the fighting style to a certain degree, the tactics used. It's not that they aren't effective. I think just sort of in that frontier space, they were seen as less optimal than what they had. Sort of a lighter cavalry being able to travel further, do more reconnaissance or whatever. It was kind of more also smaller scales. I think in the west, sort of the Balkans and also the Peloponnese sort of favored the traditional cavalry in a certain sense, where they were more useful out there. You kind of see too the Catalan mercenaries. They were a force in the 1300s who kind of came in and just went rampant for 20 years. No one could stop them. Kind of a mercenary group gone rogue, but the idea was just the terrain suited them. They were so powerful in numbers, they just couldn't be stopped. But I think you would maybe see more difficulty in the east, in the desert there, sort of not as favorable per se. Yeah, at the very back.
Emperors like you depicted with God, with Jesus, with St. George. What's the next most common?
So on coinage, you kind of see really, I guess, 3 saints. You see St. George is very common, St. Theodore is also common, St. Demetrius as well. And then you would also sometimes have an emperor adopt a namesake saint. So so Michael, on his gold coinage, he sometimes features St. Michael on there as well, as in he shares the same name, he must have special protection from you. So you would see oftentimes emperors then sort of adopt the namesake emperor. Like Theodore II, his was St. Tryphon. That was kind of sort of a minor saint from, I think, Magnesia in the area, but it was sort of like his personal devotional saint that then, because he became emperor, sort of was adopted on all the coinage. You sometimes see a certain emperor with a certain devotion then adopt a certain saint, but more often it's just kind of the common rock stars. Everyone knows St. Theodore, therefore I'll put St. Theodore on my coin. It's just easier that way, I guess. Yeah, but you kind of see St. Theodore, St. George, and St. Demetrius very common. And the later you get, the more Demetrius becomes popular. But yeah, you kind of have like an established lineup of sort of accepted saints you might use, and sometimes variation, but sort of that main cast is what you see often on coinage.
Did the saints affect the value, or were they all just the same? Not
Yeah.
like what we have on dollar bills.
Yeah, it was kind of seen just across. It had very different designs on different coins, but it was just the metal value. 2 grams of silver, 2 grams of silver.
So really the value is in the weight, not,
The weight, yeah.
not necessarily like our modern currency where it's more abstract.
Yeah. Yeah, it was like kind of a fiat economy of precious metal, whereas the coin is worth what the precious metal is worth. Just sort of the idea of why you have a design. This just kind of signifies this was struck by the emperor in his workshop. The sort of the coin design indicates it was approved by us, therefore we guarantee the purity, et cetera, et cetera. That was kind of seen as like, this has been verified, it's fine.
I understand, yeah.
Any more questions? Well, cool. I hope you all enjoyed that. I've also got the individual hands-on demonstration we can look at here. So you can kind of see, you've heard about the story, heard about the troops. Now we can see some local coins that the emperors actually demonstrated themselves. But thank you all for coming, listening, asking questions. Hope you all enjoyed it.